The morning of May 24, 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz sat alone in his command bunker beneath the Hotel Am Steinplatz in Berlin, staring at the casualty reports spread across his desk like obituaries. 41 submarines, gone. In a single month, 25% of his operational U-boat force erased from the Atlantic in 30 days. The numbers refused to make sense, even as his eyes traced them again and again across the typed columns. Unine 54, lost with all hands on May 19th. His son Peter had been aboard her as watch officer. I am 21 years old. The telegram confirming her disappearance had arrived that morning, clinical and brief, offering no details about how she died or where her iron coffin now rested on the Atlantic floor. But Dönitz couldn't afford to grieve, not yet, because the report in his hand detailed something far more catastrophic than personal loss. It detailed the systematic destruction of Germany's most effective weapon, and it revealed a tactical decision that had transformed his submarine fleet from hunters into targets. For 3 months, since late April, Dönitz had ordered his U-boats to fight back against aircraft, to remain surfaced when attacked, to man their deck guns and trade steel for steel with the Allied bombers that hunted them across the Bay of Biscay. The order had seemed logical, even necessary. The alternative, diving to escape, had stopped working. New Allied radar could detect surfaced submarines through darkness and cloud. Aircraft were finding U-boats that should have been invisible, catching them during the vulnerable transit between French bases and the open Atlantic. Crash diving took precious seconds, seconds in which bombs could fall and depth charges could bracket a boat before it reached safety. So Dönitz had gambled. If U-boats couldn't hide, perhaps they could fight. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The gamble had failed, spectacularly and bloodily. The casualty lists told that story in names and hull numbers. U-441, the specially converted flak boat with enhanced anti-aircraft guns, had shot down a Sunderland flying boat on May 24th, but returned to Brest so damaged and bloodied that she'd been withdrawn from service. 10 men killed, 13 wounded, every officer aboard hit by strafing fire. U-657, lost with all hands on May 14th to coordinated aircraft attack. U-266, sunk May 15th. U-128, destroyed May 17th. The list stretched across 2 full pages, each entry representing not just a submarine but 45 to 50 men drowned or captured, years of training obliterated, millions of Reichsmarks sunk beneath the waves. The doctrine had been clear. Standing War Order 483, issued May 1st, 1943, when aircraft attack and insufficient time exists to reach safe diving depth, U-boats will remain surfaced and engage the enemy with all available anti-aircraft weapons. Maximum submerged time during night hours. Daylight transit in groups for mutual defensive support. It made sense on paper. German flak guns had proven devastatingly effective against Allied bombers throughout the war. Short-range 20mm cannons could shred aircraft that flew low and slow, which anti-submarine planes had to do to accurately drop their depth charges. Maritime patrol craft were huge, lumbering targets derived from high-altitude bombers, never designed to face ground fire. A submarine bristling with quad-barreled Flakwehr-Lings and 37mm guns should, theoretically, turn the tables on attacking aircraft. Except theory had collided with Atlantic reality, and reality had won decisively. Dönitz closed the casualty report and reached for another document. This one stamped with intelligence markings. Intercepted Allied radio traffic indicated the British and Americans had adapted to German fightback tactics within days. When aircraft now encountered surfaced U-boats, they didn't press suicidal attacks. They circled at a safe distance and called for reinforcements. 2 aircraft became 3, became 5. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions split defensive fire. One plane would strafe the conning tower to suppress gun crews, while another dropped depth charges. Some aircraft carried rockets now, fired from beyond effective flak range. The exchanges had become mathematically uneven. A 4-engine Liberator bomber cost roughly $300,000 and carried 10 crew. A Type 7C U-boat cost $2.25 million and carried 50 men. Even if the trade was 1-for-1, which it rarely was, Germany couldn't sustain the arithmetic. The question Dönitz couldn't answer, the question that haunted every page of intelligence, analysis and patrol report, was simple and terrible. How had this happened? How had German submarine doctrine, refined through 3 years of successful Atlantic operations, collapsed so completely in a single spring? The answer lay not in courage or training, both of which remained excellent, but in technology and timing. The Allies had deployed new weapons, new sensors, new tactics, all converging in April and May 1943 into a perfect storm of anti-submarine capability. And Dönitz, responding to one threat, the invisible radar that found surfaced boats at night, had inadvertently made his submarines more vulnerable to another, the coordinated air patrols that now hunted the Bay of Biscay in overwhelming numbers. He'd ordered his boats to surface and fight at precisely the moment when surfacing had become a death sentence. To understand why Dönitz issued Standing War Order 483, you need to understand what was trying to kill his submarines in the spring of 1943. The threat wasn't new. Aircraft had been hunting U-boats since World War I. But the technology had evolved to the point where traditional evasion tactics no longer worked. For 3 years, U-boat commanders had relied on a simple survival protocol. When the aircraft appeared, it crashed immediately. A submarine on the surface was vulnerable, visible, slow. A submarine submerged became invisible, protected by hundreds of feet of seawater that absorbed bomb blasts and scattered searching sonar. The tactic had worked brilliantly through 1940, 41, and 42. U-boats lost to aircraft attack during those years numbered in the dozens, a manageable attrition rate against the hundreds of successful patrols. Then, in early 1943, everything changed. Allied aircraft began finding submarines at night, in fog, through cloud cover, under conditions where visual detection should have been impossible. U-boats that surfaced after dark, to recharge batteries, following procedures that had been safe for years, found themselves suddenly illuminated by searchlights and bracketed by depth charges. Commanders reported being detected before lookouts spotted the attacking aircraft, sometimes with no warning except the scream of bombs falling from darkness. The culprit was centimetric radar, specifically the British ASV Mark III system operating at 10 centimeters wavelength. Previous Allied radar had used longer wavelengths that German METOX detectors could sense, giving U-boats warning of approaching aircraft. The new centimetric radar was invisible to METOX, undetectable, until the search beam painted the submarine's conning tower and reflected back to the aircraft's receiver. The range exceeded 6 miles in good conditions. The radar operator could see a surfaced U-boat as a bright blip on his cathode screen, long before human eyes could spot anything against the dark ocean. The technological leap was devastating. U-boats had operated with near impunity at night for 3 years, using darkness as cover for the vulnerable hours spent surfaced, diesel engines running, batteries charging. A surface speed of 17 knots allowed rapid transit between patrol areas. Night operations let commanders shadow convoys, coordinate wolfpack attacks, maneuver into firing positions. All of that depended on remaining unseen, and suddenly the darkness no longer concealed them. April 1943 brought the crisis to a head. Allied air patrols over the Bay of Biscay, the unavoidable choke point between French U-boat bases and the open Atlantic, intensified dramatically. RAF Coastal Command launched Operation Derange on April 13th, deploying long-range aircraft equipped with the new radar in carefully coordinated patrol zones. The Bay of Biscay became a killing field. Every U-boat had to transit those waters twice per patrol, outbound and inbound, and the aircraft were waiting. Statistics told the story. In April 1943, 15 U-boats were destroyed, 6 of them in the Bay of Biscay transit. In the first 3 weeks of May, before Dönitz issued his fight-back order, 14 more boats were lost to aircraft. The rate of loss had become unsustainable. German shipyards produced roughly 20 submarines per month. Losing 15 to 20 meant the U-boat force was shrinking, not growing, and experienced commanders, the veterans who understood Atlantic warfare, were dying faster than training schools could replace them. Dönitz faced an impossible dilemma. His boats couldn't hide from the new radar. Diving took 30 to 45 seconds from alarm to safe depth, time enough for an alert aircraft to close range and drop depth charges. Many commanders reported being caught during the dive, bombs falling while the boat was at vulnerable shallow depth, unable to maneuver, stern and propellers still exposed above water. The mathematics of crash diving had turned lethal. A U-boat on the surface with full lookout watch had perhaps 90 seconds warning when an aircraft approached at patrol speed. Assuming instant recognition and immediate dive alarm, the boat needed 30 seconds to clear the bridge, seal hatches, and begin descent. Another 30 seconds to reach 100 feet, the minimum depth where the pressure hull offered real protection against near-miss explosions. That left 30 seconds for the aircraft to cover roughly half a mile and pickle its weapons. An experienced pilot flying a Liberator or Sunderland at patrol altitude could easily accomplish that, and depth charges set for shallow detonation could cripple a diving submarine before it escaped the kill zone. Dönitz's staff analysed patrol reports and casualty data, searching for tactical solutions. They identified a pattern. U-boats caught on the surface at night, unable to dive in time, were being destroyed by single aircraft. The boats fought back with whatever weapons they carried, usually a single 20mm cannon and perhaps some machine guns, but the hasty defensive fire rarely deterred determined pilots. The aircraft would make multiple attack runs, dropping depth charges or bombs in patterns that straddled the submarine's length. Even near misses could rupture fuel tanks, damage diving planes, flood compartments. A direct hit was catastrophic. But the staff also noted something else. When U-boats engaged aircraft with concentrated anti-aircraft fire, the pilots became more cautious. Several patrol reports described aircraft breaking off attacks after taking flak damage. In February 1943, U-228 had shot down a Halifax bomber during a gun battle in the bay. In March, U-441 had driven off Sunderland with heavy fire, though the boat was subsequently damaged. These were isolated incidents, but they suggested a possibility. Maybe submarines didn't have to run. Maybe they could stand and fight. The idea gained traction after a briefing from Luftwaffe liaisons, who explained how effective short-range flak guns were against low-flying aircraft. Throughout the air war over Germany, 20mm and 37mm cannons had proven to be cost-effective killers, reliably downing bombers and fighters that strayed into their range. The guns fired rapidly, put massive volumes of explosive shells into the air, and didn't require sophisticated fire control. A well-trained crew could track a target visually and walk fire onto it through observation of tracer rounds. The flak Vierling, a quad-barreled 20mm mount, was particularly deadly, firing up to 1,800 rounds per minute at a combined rate from all four barrels. Maritime patrol aircraft presented perfect targets for such weapons. The big Sunderland flying boats, short Stirlings, B-24 Liberators, these were massive four-engine aircraft derived from strategic bombers. They flew low and slow over their targets, typically under 500 feet altitude and around 150 miles per hour, to ensure accurate weapon delivery. They often made multiple passes, circling to confirm their target before attacking, and they had to fly directly at the submarine during the attack run, presenting a predictable approach vector. In theory, a U-boat with sufficient anti-aircraft firepower could force pilots to abort attacks or even shoot the aircraft down. The theory had one critical flaw. It assumed submarines made stable gun platforms, which they absolutely did not. A surfaced U-boat rolled and pitched in Atlantic swells, making accurate gunnery nearly impossible. The guns were mounted on the conning tower or on hastily added platforms, exposed to spray and weather, served by crews standing on wet steel decking. Tracking a fast-moving aircraft while the entire boat heaved beneath your feet required skill, luck, and nerve. Moreover, the gunners were completely exposed. Aircraft, machine guns, typically 50 caliber weapons on American planes or 303 caliber on British aircraft, could strafe the conning tower with devastating effect. Men manning deck guns wore no armor, had no protection except their life jackets and whatever steel structure they could crouch behind. But Dönitz was desperate, and desperate commanders made gambles. In late April 1943, he approved a radical experiment. 4 Type 7C submarines, U-441, U-256, U-621, and Unin 53, would be converted into flak boats, U-flak in German terminology. The conversions happened quickly at French shipyards. Workers stripped out 2 of the 5 torpedo tubes to save weight, reducing offensive armament from 14 torpedoes to 5. In exchange, they installed additional gun platforms forward and aft of the conning tower, mounting 2 flak-Vierling quad cannons and 1 37mm gun, plus several MG-42 machine guns. The boats bristled with weaponry, looking more like anti-aircraft platforms than submarines. Crew sizes increased from 48 to 67 men to operate all the guns. The theory was elegant. These flak boats would escort groups of attack submarines through the Bay of Biscay, deliberately attracting aircraft attention. When Allied planes approached, expecting easy targets, they'd fly into a steel storm of defensive fire. After a few aircraft losses, the logic went. The Allies would become more cautious, and the transit corridor would reopen. U-441, redesignated U-flak-1, completed conversion first and sailed from Brest on May 22, 1943. Her first patrol as a flak boat lasted exactly 3 days. On May 24th, at 8:50 in the evening, a British Sunderland flying boat from 228 Squadron spotted U-flak-1 on the surface in the Bay of Biscay. The aircraft pilot, Flying Officer H.J. Debnam, identified the submarine from several miles away and began his approach. On the submarine's bridge, 14 men, instead of the usual 4, stood watch, all scanning the sky for exactly this situation. They saw Sunderland early, perhaps 2 miles out, and the alarm sounded. But instead of crash diving, U-flak-1's commander, Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, followed his orders. The boat remained surfaced. Gun crews raced to their stations. The flak-Vierlings, already manned, tracked the incoming aircraft. Hartmann's orders were clear and terrifying. Stand and fight. The Sunderland came in low, perhaps 200 feet above the waves, closing at 160 miles per hour. At 1,500 yards, U-flak-1's guns opened fire. Tracer rounds arced up toward the aircraft, dozens of shells per second, a visible stream of explosive projectiles. The Sunderland flew into the barrage and kept coming. Debnam was committed to his attack run, aircraft nose pointing directly at the submarine. Bomb. Bay doors open. At 500 yards, hits sparkled along the flying boat's fuselage and wing. At 300 yards, the Sunderland's nose gunner returned fire, stitching the conning tower with 50 caliber rounds. Men fell. The aircraft shuddered under multiple impacts, but Debnam held course. At 200 yards, he pickled 5 depth charges, the maximum load, releasing them in a perfect stick that splashed into the water ahead of U-flak-1. The depth charges sank to their preset detonation depth of 50 feet and exploded in a rolling pattern that straddled the submarine's length. U-flak-1 heaved bodily out of the water, hull plates flexing under the shock waves. Seawater erupted in massive columns that drenched the conning tower and swept 3 gunners overboard. But the boat remained afloat, her pressure hull intact, diesels still running. Behind her, the Sunderland, trailing smoke and fuel from multiple hits, struggled to gain altitude. Debnam fought the controls, but the damage was catastrophic. The flying boat's port inner engine was dead, wing structure compromised, hydraulics failing. At 200 feet altitude and a quarter-mile past the submarine, the Sunderland stalled, rolled inverted, and plunged into the Atlantic. All 11 crew aboard died instantly on impact. U-flak-1 had won the engagement, technically. The aircraft was destroyed, but victory looked suspiciously like defeat. The submarine had suffered heavy damage from near-miss depth charges. Hull plating was sprung in multiple locations. The port diesel had suffered shock damage and was running rough. Fuel oil leaked from ruptured tanks, and the human cost was immediate and graphic. 1 crew member lay dead on the deck, killed by strafing fire. 3 others had been blown overboard by the depth charge explosions, their bodies lost in the ocean. 7 more men were wounded, including 2 with severe injuries that required immediate medical attention. Hartmann had no choice. He ordered the boat to return to Brest, mission aborted before it truly began. The engagement proved nothing, except that both sides could kill each other, which everyone already knew. The real test came 2 weeks later, when U-Flak 1 attempted her second patrol. On July 8, 1943, the boat departed Brest again, tasked with the same mission, escort duty and aircraft suppression. 4 days later, on July 12, 3 British Beaufighter aircraft from 248 Squadron found her on the surface. The Beaufighters were twin-engine, fighter-bomber aircraft, fast and maneuverable, armed with 4 20mm cannons in the nose and 6 machine guns in the wings. They attacked from 3 different directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that split U-Flak 1's defensive fire. The gun battle lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though survivors would later describe it as hours compressed into impossible seconds. The Beaufighters made repeated strafing runs, their cannons ripping through the conning tower and gun platforms. The U-boat's gunners fought back desperately, but couldn't track 3 fast-moving targets at once. Tracer fire laced the sky in chaotic patterns. Shell casings littered the deck. Men screamed orders, warnings, and prayers. The Beaufighters' cannon shells, 20mm high-explosive rounds, shredded exposed crew and equipment. 1 gunner took a direct hit and simply ceased to exist, replaced by red mist. Another fell backward off the conning tower, clutching the ruins of his chest. A third collapsed across his gun, legs gone below the knee. When the Beaufighters finally broke off, low on ammunition and damaged by return fire, U-Flak 1 was a floating butcher shop. 10 men lay dead on the blood-slick deck. 13 others were wounded, several critically. Every officer aboard, including Commander Hartmann, had been hit. The boat's doctor, Marine Stabsast Doctor, Paul Pfaffinger, was the only officer still functional. He found himself in command of a crippled submarine filled with dying men, enemy aircraft potentially inbound, and the French coast 2 days away. Pfaffinger, who had never commanded anything larger than a medical station, ordered the boat to dive. They submerged to 150 feet and crept south at 3 knots, while Pfaffinger and his medical orderlies worked frantically to stabilize the wounded. The doctor performed emergency surgery in the cramped forward torpedo room, amputating shattered limbs, packing abdominal wounds, administering morphine from dwindling supplies. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. U-Flak 1 surfaced after dark and limped into Brest on July 13th, listing to port, decks still stained with dried blood. Pfaffinger received the German Cross in Gold for bringing the boat home, an award normally reserved for combat heroism. The citation made no mention of the real reason for the decoration. He'd salvaged a propaganda disaster. If U-Flak 1 had been lost with all hands, the flak boat experiment would have been revealed as an immediate catastrophic failure. By bringing her back, even crippled, Pfaffinger gave Dönitz room to claim the tactic needed refinement rather than abandonment. But everyone from admiral to ordinary seaman understood the truth. The flak boats had failed. Standing War Order 483 had failed, and U-boat crews were dying because of it. The problem extended far beyond the specialized flak boats. In early May, Dönitz had ordered all U-boats, not just the converted ones, to fight back against aircraft when caught on the surface. The order applied to every submarine transiting the Bay of Biscay, which meant every submarine, since that was the only route from French bases to the Atlantic hunting grounds. Commanders were specifically instructed to remain surfaced and engage with anti-aircraft fire rather than crash diving when aircraft approached. The rationale was that diving had stopped working anyway, so fighting back at least offered a chance of survival. But the order created a perverse situation where U-boat commanders, trained for years to dive when threatened, now had to override every survival instinct and stand their ground against aircraft that could kill them from ranges where defensive fire was ineffective. The crews hated it. Patrol reports and post-war interviews revealed near universal opposition to the fight-back doctrine among submarine personnel. Standing exposed on a conning tower while aircraft strafed you went against everything submarine warfare represented. The boats had been designed for stealth, for striking unseen and escaping into the depths. Forcing them into surface gun battles turned submarines into sitting targets, trading the advantage of invisibility for a slim chance of shooting down the attacker, and the chance was slim. Between May 1st and mid-August 1943, when Dönitz finally rescinded the order, U-boats shot down 32 Allied aircraft. The tally sounds impressive until you compare it against losses. During the same period, aircraft sank 26 U-boats and heavily damaged 17 more. The mathematics was brutal: 32 aircraft destroyed versus 26 submarines sunk and 17 damaged. But those numbers concealed the real disparity. The 32 aircraft represented machines that cost between $90,000 and $300,000 each, with crews of 5 to 12 men. The 43 U-boats destroyed or damaged represented investments of over $2 million each and crews of 50 men per boat. Over 2,000 German submariners died or were wounded fighting aircraft during those 4 months, compared to perhaps 300 Allied airmen killed. Even worse, the U-boats achieving those aircraft kills often sustained heavy damage. Doing so, shooting down a bomber didn't help if your boat was too crippled to continue the patrol. U-450 provides a representative example. On June 6, 1943, a British flying fortress from 220 Squadron caught the submarine on the surface, roughly 150 miles southeast of Iceland. Commander Rudolf Bahr followed standing orders. The boat remained surfaced, and gunners engaged the approaching bomber. The flying fortress, a 4-engine B-17 heavy bomber, was massive and slow by fighter standards, but still moved at over 200 miles per hour. It attacked from altitude, diving toward the submarine with all guns firing. The U-boat's 20mm cannon scored multiple hits, but the bomber kept coming and dropped depth charges that exploded close alongside. The concussion killed 1 crewman instantly and wounded 7 others. U-450's pressure hull cracked in 3 places. Seawater flooded the control room. The port diesel failed. Bahr managed to keep the boat afloat and began the agonizing journey back to Brest, taking 10 days to cover waters he'd crossed in 3 days outbound. The boat survived, barely, but was out of action for 2 months while shipyard workers replaced hull sections and repaired systems. The patrol achieved nothing except proving that U-boats could sometimes damage attacking aircraft, a lesson whose cost vastly exceeded its value. Stories like U-450s multiplied throughout May and June. U-214, commanded by Capitan Lieutenant Gunther Rieder, was attacked on May 7th by a Halifax bomber while outbound through the bay. Rieder kept his boat surfaced and fought back. The Halifax's pilot, Wing Commander W.E. Alton, attacked from out of the sun, his aircraft diving with all guns firing. The U-boat's anti-aircraft fire hit the bomber multiple times, but Alton pressed through and dropped depth charges that straddled the submarine. Rieder himself was severely wounded by strafing fire, hit in the chest and shoulder. His first watch officer, Oberleutnant Ruprecht Stock, took command and brought U-214 back to Brest. Rieder survived but never returned to submarine duty. He'd followed orders, stayed surfaced, fought back. The bomber escaped, damaged but operational. The U-boat commander was permanently disabled. These weren't isolated incidents or bad luck. They represented the systematic failure of a doctrine that pitted submarines against aircraft in conditions where aircraft held every advantage. The attackers chose when and where to strike. They spotted surfaced U-boats from miles away, using radar, closed at high speed, and initiated combat on their terms. The submarines, once detected, had limited options. Crash diving took too long and often resulted in being caught at vulnerable shallow depth. Remaining surfaced meant enduring repeated strafing runs and bomb drops while trying to hit fast-moving targets from an unstable, wave-tossed platform. Allied pilots adapted quickly to the new German tactics. Initial encounters with aggressively fighting U-boats surprised some crews, and several aircraft were damaged or shot down in the first weeks of May. But the Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in training capacity, industrial production, and tactical flexibility. Air commanders simply instructed pilots to be more cautious when encountering a surfaced U-boat, circle at safe distance, outside effective anti-aircraft range, and call for assistance. Then coordinate attacks from multiple directions with other aircraft or surface vessels. The British 2nd Support Group, Captain Frederick John Walker, commanding 5 sloops, specialised in responding to aircraft reports of surfaced submarines. An aircraft would maintain contact, circling the U-boat at altitude, while warships raced to the scene. The submarine commander faced an impossible choice: remain surfaced and eventually be overwhelmed by coordinated forces, or dive and risk depth charge attacks while trying to escape submerged. Either way, the patrol was compromised, the mission failed, survival doubtful. The climactic battle that best illustrated the futility of Dönitz's fight-back order came on July 30th, 1943. 3 U-boats, U-461, U-504, and U-462, were transiting the Bay of Biscay in formation as ordered, providing mutual defensive support. 7 Allied aircraft converged on their position, a coordinated strike force of Liberators, Halifaxes, and Sunderlands. The submarines remained surfaced and opened fire with every anti-aircraft weapon they carried. The gun battle lasted over an hour, a running engagement that scattered across miles of ocean. The U-boats' concentrated fire damaged several attacking aircraft, scoring hits on fuselages and wings, forcing some pilots to break off temporarily. But the Allied crews coordinated their attacks perfectly, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, dividing the defensive fire. One aircraft would strafe a submarine's conning tower to suppress the gun crews, while another dropped depth charges from a different angle. The submarines fought desperately, their flak-vierlings pumping streams of 20mm explosive shells into the sky, tracer rounds creating luminous arcs against the clouds. U-461 was hit first. A pattern of depth charges from a Halifax exploded alongside her hull, rupturing fuel tanks and flooding the aft torpedo room. The boat began listing heavily to port, her stern settling lower in the water. Commander Wolf Stiebler ordered the crew to abandon ship. Men jumped into the Atlantic as the submarine slowly rolled over. A second aircraft, a Liberator, made another attack run, dropping more depth charges near the sinking boat. Some of the men in the water were killed by the concussion. Others drowned as the submarine's final plunge created a whirlpool that sucked them under. U-504 fought on for another 30 minutes after U-461 went down. Commander Fritz Poska kept his guns firing even as repeated, strafing runs killed and wounded his crew. The conning tower was riddled with holes. Bodies lay crumpled on the deck. Still, Posk refused to surrender or dive. He'd followed orders, stayed surfaced, fought back. A Sunderland flying boat from 10 Squadron RAAF finally finished U-504 with a perfectly placed pattern of depth charges that cracked the pressure hull. The boat stopped and began to sink, men appearing on deck in life jackets. Another aircraft arrived and attacked again, the depth charge explosions throwing bodies into the air. U-462, the supply submarine, was the largest and least manoeuvrable of the 3 boats. She'd been designed to refuel and resupply attack submarines at sea, not to fight surface gun battles. Commander Bruno Vau watched his 2 escorts destroyed and knew his boat would be next. He'd already taken damage from near misses. The forward deck gun was wrecked, its crew dead. The starboard diesel was failing. Depth charge concussions had sprung leaks in multiple compartments. Captain Frederick John Walker's 2nd Escort Group arrived on scene, 5 sloops racing toward the aircraft's position. Vau finally dove, but U-462 was too damaged to escape. Walker's ships gained ASDIC contact and pursued a methodical depth charge attack that lasted 3 hours. The supply submarine eventually surfaced, crippled and unable to dive again. Walker's ships closed in and finished her with gunfire. The battle killed over 150 German submariners. Allied forces rescued some survivors, but many drowned or died from injuries before help arrived. The exchange rate was horrifying. 3 irreplaceable submarines were destroyed, including a valuable supply boat that supported operational patrols for weeks at a time in return for minor damage to aircraft that returned to base and were repaired within days. The tactical bankruptcy of Standing War Order 483 could not have been demonstrated more clearly, yet Dönitz maintained the order for another 3 weeks. On August 2, 1943, he finally rescinded the fight-back directive. 4 additional U-boats were sunk in the Bay of Biscay during the first 2 days of August by Coastal Command aircraft, the final casualties of a doctrine that had achieved nothing except accelerating the destruction of the submarine force. The new orders directed U-boats to resume crash diving when aircraft appeared, to transit the bay, hugging the Spanish coast where Allied radar was less effective, and to surface only at night for minimum time necessary to recharge batteries. The damage was done. In July 1943 alone, No. 19 Group RAF Coastal Command sank 11 U-boats, 1/3 of all Allied submarine kills that month. Between May and August, aircraft attacks accounted for 18 of the 25 U-boats sunk throughout the world. The Bay of Biscay, once a routine transit corridor, had become what German submariners called the Valley of Death, where U-boats died within hours of leaving port. In November 1943, Dönitz cancelled refits to convert 3 more flak boats and reverted the existing ones to standard configuration. The experiment had absolutely failed. The psychological impact on surviving crews was profound and permanent. Men who'd served on U-boats during the fight-back period described the experience in terms that modern psychologists would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The terror of standing exposed on a conning tower while aircraft strafed you, the helplessness of watching comrades torn apart by cannon shells, the guilt of surviving when so many friends had died, these experiences marked submariners permanently. Obermaschinist Mart Erich Topp served aboard U-552 during multiple patrols in 1943. In post-war interviews, he described the psychological transformation that occurred during those months. "We sailed out as warriors. We returned as survivors, if we returned at all. The confidence we'd felt in our boats, in our tactics, in our ability to hunt and escape, all of that was gone. We knew we were being sent out to die. The only question was whether death would come from aircraft, from escorts, from mechanical failure, or from some combination of all 3. Top Submarine survived the war, one of only a handful from her flotilla. But survival didn't mean escape. For decades after the war, Top suffered nightmares. He'd dream he was back on the conning tower, guns firing uselessly at aircraft, diving from the clouds, shells exploding all around, men screaming. He'd wake in cold sweat, heart pounding, unable to return to sleep. The dreams never stopped, even 50 years later. The war had marked him indelibly. Other survivors reported similar symptoms. Depression was common, as was what modern medicine would call survivor's guilt. Why had they lived when so many comrades had died? The question had no answer, but it haunted them. Some turned to alcohol. Others withdrew from social contact, unable to relate to people who hadn't experienced submarine warfare's particular horror. A few committed suicide years after the war ended, the delayed toll of psychological wounds that never healed. The German Navy recognized the problem, but had no solution. By late 1943, experienced submarine commanders were becoming scarce. Casualties had destroyed the veteran cadre who'd fought in 1940, 41, and 42. The replacements were younger, less experienced, and often inadequately trained. Training time had been shortened from 12 months to 6 months, then to 4 months as losses accelerated faster than training schools could produce qualified crews. Young men barely out of their teens were given command of submarines and sent against an enemy who'd mastered anti-submarine warfare. Captain Lieutenant Teddy Suren, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, was reassigned to training duties in 1943 specifically because Dönitz wanted to preserve his most experienced captains as instructors. Suren watched the quality of new crews deteriorate month by month. In his memoir, published decades after the war, he described the tragedy of sending inadequately trained young commanders to almost certain death. They hadn't logged enough hours. They didn't know their boats intimately. They'd never faced a determined escort attack or coordinated aircraft strikes. We were sending them out to learn through experience that would probably kill them before they learned anything useful. The statistical reality supported Surin's grim assessment. In 1940 and 41, a new U-boat commander could expect to complete 3 or 4 successful patrols before being killed, captured, or promoted to staff positions. By late 1943, the average new commander completed less than 1 patrol. Most were dead within 2 months of departing on their first mission. The learning curve had become a death curve, and there was nothing training could do to flatten it because the enemy's technological and tactical advantages were simply too overwhelming. Germany introduced improved Naxos radar detectors, snorkels, allowing submarines to take in air while shallowly submerged, and the pioneering Type 21 diesel-electric boats, which could sustain high underwater speeds and remain submerged for days. But these technologies arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. The Type 21 submarines, revolutionary designs that might have restored German tactical advantages, didn't reach operational status until April 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender. Only 2 completed combat patrols. The war was over before they could make any difference. The snorkel, adapted from captured Dutch technology, proved more useful, but still couldn't restore U-boat effectiveness. The device allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, eliminating the need to fully surface for battery charging. In theory, boats could remain underwater for entire patrols. In practice, snorkeling operations were miserable and dangerous. Allied radar could detect even the small snorkel head above the water surface, and coordinated attacks by aircraft and surface vessels remained deadly. The final toll of standing war order. 483 and the broader collapse of U-boat effectiveness in 1943 was staggering. Between May and October 1943, U-flak submarines were dispatched on 7 patrols. Even when U-boats shot down aircraft, they often sustained heavy damage in return. In May alone, 43 U-boats were destroyed, representing 25% of the U-boat arms. Total operational strength. The Allies lost 58 ships in the same period, 34 of these in the Atlantic. The exchange rate had shifted decisively against Germany. Admiral Dönitz admitted, "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic." The fight-back order had been his desperate gamble to restore U-boat effectiveness in the face of overwhelming Allied technological superiority. The gamble had failed catastrophically, costing hundreds of lives and dozens of irreplaceable submarines. Worse, it had revealed to the Allies that German submarine doctrine had reached a dead end. The U-boats no longer represented the existential threat they'd posed in 1942. They'd become targets, not hunters. The strategic consequences extended far beyond casualty lists. Prime Minister Churchill boasted that the Kriegsmarine had not sunk a single Allied merchant ship on North Atlantic convoy routes between May 1st and September 15th, 1943. The submarine blockade, that had nearly starved Britain into submission in 1942, had been broken. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with minimal losses. The massive build-up of American troops and equipment for the invasion of Europe proceeded without significant interference. In August 1943, only 4 ships were sunk by U-boats in the Atlantic during the month, all during the first week, and all south of the equator. The worldwide shipping losses to U-boats in August were only 15 ships of 87,000 gross tons. Compare that to March 1943, when U-boats had sunk 120 merchant ships, totaling almost 700,000 tons. The collapse was total and irreversible. For the men who survived the fight-back period and returned to Germany, life after the war proved difficult in ways that had nothing to do with physical injuries. Many struggled to find purpose or meaning in civilian existence. The intense camaraderie of submarine service, where your life depended absolutely on your crewmates, couldn't be replicated in peacetime. Some veterans found civilian life boring, lacking the intensity and significance of wartime service despite its horrors. Hans Burke, who served as petty officer aboard U-667 until she was sunk in July 1943, kept a journal throughout his service. He was one of only 3 survivors rescued from the water after his boat was destroyed by American aircraft. In post-war interviews, Burke described the profound sense of loss he felt, not just for dead comrades, but for the loss of purpose and identity. In the U-boat, I knew who I was. I knew what I was supposed to do. Every action had meaning, even if that meaning was just survival. After the war, in the wreckage of Germany, nothing seemed to matter. We'd fought for something that turned out to be evil, and now we had to live with that knowledge. The moral reckoning was particularly difficult for U-boat veterans. Unlike soldiers, who'd fought on the Eastern Front or participated in occupation duties, submariners hadn't personally witnessed or participated in Nazi atrocities. They'd fought what they considered a clean war, attacking enemy shipping according to naval traditions and international law. But they'd fought for Hitler's regime, and that fact couldn't be escaped or rationalized. Some veterans spent decades reconciling their wartime service with the knowledge of what their government had done. Peter Peterson, who'd served aboard U-518 beginning in August 1943, immigrated to the United States after the war. In a 2001 interview, he reflected on the moral complexity of his service. "We were young men doing our duty as we understood it. We didn't know about the concentration camps. We didn't know the full extent of what Hitler's government was doing. But ignorance isn't innocence. We served that regime, and we have to carry that responsibility. Tried to serve honorably, to treat prisoners with respect when we took them, to obey the laws of war as I understood them. It doesn't excuse anything, but it's all I have." The technical lessons learned from the fight-back period influenced post-war military thinking profoundly. The Bay of Biscay battles demonstrated conclusively that submarines could not successfully fight aircraft on the surface. The idea seems obvious in retrospect, but in 1943 it required brutal experimentation to prove. The flakboat conversions, the tactical orders to remain surfaced and engage, the desperate attempts to turn submarines into anti-aircraft platforms. All of these represented reasonable theories that failed when tested against operational reality. Military analysts studying the Battle of the Atlantic after the war identified several key factors that explained the U-boat's defeat. Technological superiority was primary. Allied centimetric radar, improved sonar, airborne depth, charges, acoustic homing torpedoes. These innovations gave anti-submarine forces decisive advantages, but technology alone wasn't sufficient. The Allies also achieved numerical superiority, producing escort vessels and patrol aircraft faster than Germany could build submarines. They mastered coordination between air and surface forces, creating integrated anti-submarine systems where individual components reinforced each other. Most critically, Allied doctrine evolved rapidly in response to German tactics. When U-boats began fighting back on the surface, Allied aircraft adapted within days by coordinating attacks and calling for support. When U-boats started hugging the Spanish coast, Allied patrol patterns shifted to cover those routes. The Germans, constrained by industrial limitations and doctrinal rigidity, couldn't match that pace of adaptation. Dönitz's fight-back order represented his best attempt to solve a tactical problem, but it was solving the wrong problem. The real issue wasn't how U-boats engaged aircraft. It was that aircraft could find submarines reliably using technology Germany couldn't counter. The human cost of that miscalculation was measured in thousands of lives. By the end of World War II, the Kriegsmarine had lost 678 out of 1,154 U-boats to hostile action. Of these, roughly 250 were lost to aircraft and 264 to surface vessels. Aircraft alone accounted for over a third of all U-boat losses, a proportion that increased dramatically during the fightback period when submarines remained surfaced instead of diving to escape. Of the 30,000 German submariners who served during the war, approximately 28,000 died, a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. Those numbers represented not just statistics but individuals, young men who'd volunteered for submarine duty, undergone rigorous training, formed tight bonds with their crewmates, and then died in iron coffins at the bottom of the Atlantic. They died following orders that their commanders believed would save them, but which instead hastened their destruction. The legacy of Standing War Order 483 extends beyond its immediate tactical failure. It represents a case study in how desperation can drive military leaders to make catastrophically wrong decisions. Dönitz faced an impossible situation in May 1943. His submarines were being destroyed at unsustainable rates. Traditional evasion tactics had stopped working. New Allied technologies had eliminated the tactical advantages U-boats had enjoyed for 3 years. He needed to do something, anything, to restore operational effectiveness. The fightback order seemed logical. If crash diving no longer provided safety, perhaps aggressive defense would. The mathematics of weapon effectiveness supported the theory. Flak guns were proven aircraft killers. Maritime patrol planes were large, slow, vulnerable targets. A well-armed submarine with a trained gun crew should be able to drive off or shoot down attacking aircraft. On paper, the doctrine made sense. But warfare isn't conducted on paper. It's conducted in the chaos and complexity of real-world conditions, where theories collide with physics, where tactics meet countermeasures, where human limitations trump theoretical advantages. The U-boats discovered that submarines made terrible gun platforms, that gun crews couldn't track multiple fast-moving targets, that aircraft could coordinate attacks in ways that split defensive fire, that even shooting down an attacker often came at the cost of crippling damage to the submarine. Dönitz's error wasn't in trying something new. His error was in maintaining the order for 3 months after it became clear the tactic was failing. April and May losses should have provided sufficient evidence that the fight-back approach was worse than useless. It was actively counterproductive, keeping U-boats exposed on the surface during attacks when diving, even if it didn't guarantee escape, at least removed them from the immediate kill zone. Yet the order remained in effect through June, July, and into August, accumulating casualties that might have been avoided. The reason for this persistence reveals something important about command psychology under stress. Dönitz had staked his reputation and his strategic judgment on the fight-back order. Rescinding it quickly would have meant admitting a major mistake, acknowledging that his response to the crisis had made things worse. Such admissions are difficult for any leader, especially during wartime when confidence and decisiveness are valued above self-doubt. So, Dönitz maintained the order, hoping that persistence would eventually yield results, that U-boat crews would master the tactics, that Allied aircraft would suffer enough losses to become cautious. That hope was never realistic. The Allied advantage in industrial production alone guaranteed they could replace aircraft losses faster than Germany could build submarines. But hope isn't always rational, especially when the alternative is accepting defeat. Dönitz didn't rescind Standing War Order 483 until the casualty reports made its failure absolutely undeniable, until even the most optimistic interpretation of the data couldn't suggest the doctrine was working. The submariners who survived the fight-back period, men like Eric Topp, Peter Peterson, Hans Burke, and thousands of others, carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They'd followed orders to stand and fight when every instinct screamed at them to dive. They'd watched friends die in surface gun battles that should never have been fought. They'd survived through luck rather than skill. And they knew it. That knowledge, the understanding that their survival was essentially random, created a particular type of psychological trauma that persisted decades after the guns fell silent. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.